This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on tonight is Kaurna land, and we wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and to acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship they have with their traditional land. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia to our event with Director of Human Rights Watch Australia, Elaine Pearson, as she discusses her new book, Chasing Wrongs and Rights. Elaine will be in conversation with award-winning journalist, Professor Peter Greste, as they discuss Elaine's experience defending human rights around the world. And I warmly welcome you both here to the Hawke Centre. It's wonderful to have you here. Thank you. Elaine Pearson is the Director of Human Rights Watch Australia, where she works to influence Australian foreign and domestic policies in order to give them a human rights dimension. From 2007 to 2012, she was the Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division, based in New York. She has conducted numerous human rights investigations in Australia and around the world. So please join me in welcoming Elaine Pearson and Peter Greste. Thank you.
I want to say, first of all, just what a great honour it is to be sharing the stage with Elaine. As anyone who knows anything about human rights in Australia will know of the incredibly important role that Human Rights Watch plays, not just here in Australia, but of course around the world. And if you've been paying attention, if you know of human rights, then of course you will know of Elaine Pearson. And I've also got a very personal debt of gratitude to owe to both Elaine and to Human Rights Watch for the role that they played in getting me out of prison when I was in Egypt. I know that Human Rights Watch doesn't always take on individual cases, but from time to time, and as we'll discuss this evening, they'll pick on particular cases that turn out to be emblematic for much bigger issues, and I think in that respect they got involved with my case, and so it was a massively important thing. So Elaine, this book is remarkable. It's a fantastic book, Chasing Wrongs and Rights, and I know that you're all going to rush out, if you haven't already bought a copy, to get hold of a copy, because it's not like your classic Human Rights Watch report. You've written plenty of these over the years. They use very dry language, they're very direct, they're very formal things. This is not that. This is much more personal. Was it difficult to make that transition?
Yeah, it was tough actually, because I think working at Human Rights Watch for such a long time, you know, you get trained to write in a certain very sort of lawyerly way, just report the facts objectively, don't put yourself in the story. It's a bit similar to journalism, I guess, in that way. But my idea with this book was to do something different. It was to sort of, I guess, pull back that curtain of how Human Rights Watch does its work, and also share, I guess, my own, you know, feelings about the work, the challenges, the successes, the frustrations, and, you know, even some of the, you know, more amusing, I guess, moments that you sometimes have in doing this work.
Did you feel a bit exposed, a bit naked in writing about yourself this way?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it does make you feel a bit vulnerable to do that. But I also felt that that was really an important part of the story. And I felt like, you know, often when I speak about my work, you know, there are young people really interested in social justice and human rights who always want to know my backstory, like, how did you start doing human rights work? You know, what were the steps that you took? And so I also thought I should tell some of that story, because I didn't come from, you know, a family of lawyers or human rights activists. My own trajectory was somewhat different.
Let's just stick with the personal for a moment, because although you said that your trajectory was a bit different, you've also got, well, your family has encountered human rights issues, and you write very touchingly in various places. It's almost a bit of a thread that runs through the whole book, about your grandmother. Can you tell us a little bit about her experience and how that kind of, I don't know if it's right to say that it informed your human rights work, but it was certainly something that came up.
Yeah, I mean, my grandmother actually looms larger in the book than I probably had envisaged when I first planned the book, but she was a really remarkable woman. On my mother's side, so my mother is Singaporean-Chinese, and my grandmother grew up in poverty in rural China, in southern China. She was born in 1916. And at the age of 10, many in her village were starving, and she says that she sold herself willingly to an opera troupe because she thought that in the opera troupe she would be able to eat rice 3 times a day. And they weren't even eating rice at that stage. So she was sold for 300 taels of silver, and she was taken to Singapore.
So she was a victim of human trafficking?
She was, and I really didn't make that connection until much later. I mean, I guess it's a thing in Asian families that you don't really talk much about the bad things that happened in the past. It's almost like that's shameful. And so, I knew she became quite an opera star in Singapore. So I knew this story, and I knew that she'd been sold to the troupe as a child. But, I didn't know the full extent of it until I just wanted to confirm some of the facts as I was writing this book. And I came across these audio recordings in the Singaporean National Archives.
And before we move on, there is just one moment in the book that it's not about human rights, but I really do want you to tell the story of how your mother was found. Your grandmother was found.
Oh, how she reunited with her mother.
With her mother.
Yeah, so she was sold, she was taken to Singapore, she was then sold to another troupe that took her back to China. And at the age of, I think she was about 17, she was performing on stage. And there was a woman in the audience who was making a bit of noise, who was crying, and she was in this starring role, and she was like, get this woman, away. She's like disturbing me, disturbing my performance. And it was only later, backstage, that the woman came up to her and said, don't you recognize your own mother? And so it was this amazing reunion. And, I had heard this story that, my great-grandmother had actually gone to Singapore looking for her, but had been unable to find her, and so then had returned to China. And, really from that moment on, they didn't really separate. I mean, my great-grandmother lived with my grandparents until she died, in their tiny, HBD flat in Singapore.
And this whole story is really poignant too, because particularly in the early part of the book, you spend quite a bit of time discussing human trafficking, particularly of women. In the cases that you look at, mostly sex workers. One of the things that really emerges in that discussion is just how deeply complex a lot of these stories really are. First of all, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the way in which we often tend to victimize the victims. That's something that I think you really dive into quite beautifully in the book.
Yeah, I mean, so I started my human rights journey, I guess, working on human trafficking, and I think I was really lucky that one of my sort of foremost experiences as, a 23-year-old recently graduated law student was to travel to Geneva and attend this really amazing meeting of feminists, and it turned out to be quite a battle between 2 different groups of NGOs arguing over what was the definition of trafficking. And I naively had assumed that all the NGOs would be on the same side, that we'd all just be lobbying the government. But I met, this really diverse bunch of women. I met domestic workers from Bolivia, sex workers from India, academics, former Khmer Rouge survivors, and they were all part of this alliance of organizations that I ended up working for their secretariat in Bangkok. And what they really taught me was that it's really important to put the voices of affected people front and center of any sort of policy discussions and recommendations about how to fix those problems. And so, I think that's a key principle of human rights work. But, for a lot of governments and for some organizations that are trying to work on trafficking, it can often be this kind of savior approach of, simply trying to sort of rescue and do the right thing by a group of victims without actually really understanding the complexities of the situations that, a lot of migrant women find themselves in.
And when you talk about a savior approach, You described the way, and I've seen this as well in a lot of my work in places like Africa and the Middle East, where these NGOs, in trying to save these girls from sex work, actually lock them up. They re-imprison them, they re-victimize them because they feel that sex work is immoral or disempowering in some way. And I suppose for some women it probably is, but that can make the situation worse, can't it?
Yeah, I mean, what I had found, when I visited, numerous countries from Nigeria to Nepal to Thailand, was that, the human rights violations weren't over when someone was rescued or escaped from their trafficking situation. Too many times they might be sent to a shelter which ended up effectively being like a detention centre where people, couldn't leave. And, maybe they weren't being sort of physically exploited. But I noticed in interviewing, women in such conditions that they used a lot of the same language that they had described to describe their trafficking situation, to describe then the situation when they were basically being held captive in some of these shelters. So our approach was really to put human rights front and centre, and a big part of that is about choice for women, and also women who have been enslaved and captured. It's also about listening to their voice and letting them make decisions.
Even if that includes continuing with sex work?
Yes, and I think that was the big distinction that I learnt early on in Geneva, is that there is a distinction between women who choose to do sex work and women who are forced into sex work or deceived or coerced and who don't have the freedom to leave. And I remember very clearly this amazing sex worker from Calcutta who stood up in this UN meeting, and she said, I'm not a criminal, I pay my rent, I'm here to speak on behalf of 40,000 sex workers in Calcutta, and we know, we want to stop the trafficking, the exploitation of children, but we know how to do that, and you need to work with us, not just criminalise us, because too often I think when the whole sex industry is criminalised, it simply makes it harder, actually, for people who are being forced and coerced to obtain help.
And Elaine, you do a lot of, in that particular case, you did a lot of extraordinary work and a lot of extraordinary research as well.
Yeah,
and you know where I'm headed with this.
I do talk about experiences in Amsterdam, in the red light district, in the windows. Doing human rights work, you're not just sitting behind a desk, like reading laws and writing your reports. And it really is about getting out, talking to people, talking to sex workers, talking to victims of trafficking, talking to brothel owners. And sometimes that can be quite confronting. And
stepping into the window in a brothel in Amsterdam on display yourself.
I
see what it's like.
I definitely was not expecting to have that experience. And I think, but it was very confronting, actually, to find myself, suddenly.
One of the things I think, and I know it as a journalist, that we often oversimplify some of these human rights issues, but one of the things I remember being struck by in reading particularly that section was the complexities of solving these problems. It's simply not enough to say we're going to stop trafficking of women by stopping the movement of people over the border, or we're going to lock up all of the traffickers themselves, or we're going to lock up all of the women. That doesn't solve the problem, does it? Because there are push factors as well as pull factors.
Well, it doesn't recognise that, there are a whole lot of reasons why someone may be having to make that difficult choice to leave their home in order to obtain employment. And so, one of the sort of programs that we were evaluating in Nepal was, basically a group of NGOs that thought they were doing the right thing in stopping young women who they perceived to be potential victims of trafficking from travelling across the border to India. But certainly what we perceived was that, these were not law enforcement, they were not government officials, they were, in many cases, survivors of trafficking or young women who'd been sort of rescued through this NGO system, and they were disrupting the ability of young people to travel. And I think, a better, more rights-based approach is to provide access to information, help, if you're traveling to India, these are your rights. Do you have a job contract? Who is that contract with? Finding out sort of, I guess, the places where people can also go to for help, rather than necessarily just, forcibly restricting someone from travelling, which ultimately, in many cases, resulted in people just, simply, having to take another trip, through another channel.
And often we seem to see these human rights issues, and I understand that it's necessary a lot of the times when you're dealing with advocacy to see them as binaries, as good victims and as bad perpetrators. But even that can sometimes get mushy, can't it? Or is it do we need to see it in those terms?
I think the perpetrators of human rights violations are always going to be the perpetrators, and they should be held to account. But I guess when it comes to clients of sex workers, I have interviewed many former victims who have talked about how clients, it was a client who gave me a phone number, it was a client who let me make a phone call to ultimately help them escape a situation. And I think that is also sometimes lost. And the need to not necessarily just demonize people who are using the services of sex workers, but also actually enlist them in ensuring that they know how to spot and assist people who are being forced or deceived or exploited in the sex industry.
I want to move on a little bit to talk about human rights work itself. And I know that in quite a few places, and I've seen this as well myself, I remember in Ethiopia, where the government had come to regard human rights workers as agents of foreign interference in some way, as somehow trying to destabilise the country, demonising the work that human rights workers themselves do. Is it getting harder to do the job that you do?
Oh, definitely. I think in the 14 years now I've been with Human Rights Watch, the space for civil society in so many countries where we're working is really shrinking. And, these new laws get passed which are very vague. In some countries, human rights work is considered an act of terrorism. It's considered an act against the state. Hong Kong is a prime example where now you have a national security law that is so incredibly broad that all sorts of things that would be, considered quite normal and unremarkable in a democracy, criticising the government, are now punishable offences. You just had the other week, some authors of a children's book be charged and convicted of sedition because the book was about, telling the story of the pro-democracy activists in the protests. So I think this is a real challenge, that line, and you know this better than anyone, Peter, from your own experiences in Egypt. We've had, I guess, a lot of experiences of human rights activists, particularly our partner organisations, that are coming under a lot of pressure now and are either having to move into exile or, in some cases, sitting in prisons who've been arrested and imprisoned for their activism.
Or murdered.
Or murdered, indeed.
Do you think that speaks, though, to the effectiveness of human rights workers? If you weren't having an impact, then governments wouldn't care.
Yes, no, I totally agree. I think it's because the governments don't like criticism and they can't tolerate that criticism. That's the measure of that. That's the problem with, I guess, the situation in China right now, is that any potential voice that is speaking up, even against the COVID zero policies. We've seen what happens to the people who have raised the alarm about that. They get picked up, they get disappeared, they get thrown in jail, and so it makes it, even harder to know what's actually happening now in places where, in the past we would be able to conduct. I wouldn't say in China we've ever been able to conduct human rights work openly, but I would say now it's, increasingly challenging to even talk to people, because even if we can talk to people, through the use of encrypted communications, you don't know who's monitoring those communications, and it's a huge risk. So I would say now, our challenge is how to use technology more effectively to investigate things when we can't actually have boots on the ground.
I was in fact planning to go there a little bit later, but let's address that, because you mentioned some of these technologies, encrypted apps, satellite technology and others. It's a bit of an arms race, isn't it, between outside groups trying to keep track and monitor and use the technology to expose wrongs, and governments using technology to try and shut it down.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's the challenge of our tech division now, is sort of looking at tech, both as this tool of censorship and massive surveillance, but also we are increasingly using it. And I think, that actually is something that's really positive, now, is that, even in so many countries where Human Rights Watch can't actively be on the ground, in places like Iran, in China, in Myanmar, in Afghanistan, people are still recording stuff using their phones. They're taking photographs, they're taking videos. And so we are able to, we have a whole team now that does digital investigations, and so they verify photos, images. We use satellites. Rakhine State in Myanmar, when the Rohingya were fleeing across the border from Myanmar to Bangladesh, that was a case where we didn't have access to Rakhine State, but we could cross-check the information that the refugees were telling us about what was happening in their villages with the images of the satellites that were showing that villages had been razed to the ground. Now, the satellite doesn't tell you who did that, but then we cross-checked that with information about the troop movements by the Myanmar military, which is in publicly accessible information in the Gazette. It told us that the troops were moving through those areas. So, this is, the new way, I guess, that human rights investigators are doing their work, despite, all of the attempts by governments to keep us out. We still find ways to expose what is going on.
Are you ahead of the curve, do you think?
Sorry?
Are you ahead of the governments?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, it's definitely, I think you've mentioned it's like an arms race. I mean, I think it is a bit like that. My colleagues in the China team managed to sort of de-engineer an app that was being used in Xinjiang, and on the basis of the information in that app, it basically determines people whose behaviour is deemed suspicious, who can be sent to political re-education camps. But actually, understanding how law enforcement in China is actually gathering these massive amounts of information. And it's all sorts of information that you would think, is quite mild. It's where you're going to have your coffee, who you're meeting up with, who else is there at the same time, whether you use the front door or the back door is, can be considered suspicious, whether you're going to the mosque. And it's sort of correlating all of that information, whether you have certain apps on your phone, whether you use WhatsApp, whether you use Signal to communicate with others, if you use VPNs. So it really is quite chilling, I think, the way some governments are using that technology and also exporting that technology to other governments.
But it is also impressive the way that you're able to also keep track of things and expose and report on the kinds of abuses that governments are trying to keep hidden. Is it easier or harder, do you think, for governments to get away with abuses than it used to be?
I think it's harder for them to get away with abuses. I think in the way that previously it would be harder to get information. But now, we know what's going on. Even a place like Xinjiang, where foreign journalists don't have access, we don't have access. We've still been able to get, a lot of information. And the UN just published a very detailed, very strong report about what is happening inside those camps. So I don't think governments can hide. I think what worries me now is that some governments don't even try to hide those abuses. They'll try and say that, it's not abuses. And the Australian government is one of them. Look at what the Australian government has done with offshore processing. It's not like they're denying that is taking place.
Well, we will come to Australia shortly. I know that there's quite a lot to discuss when it comes to our own country. But before we do, and I don't want to go on a little sort of world tour of human rights abuses, you've covered that remarkably well, but there are a few cases, I think, that are worth diving into in a little bit more detail. And one of those issues is impunity. I know a lot of people say that we should let history be history. We shouldn't dive into some of these crises to dredge up old hatreds, to sort of reignite some of the emotions that people have gone through, that we should move on from these crises. And I'm thinking of two that you deal with in the book in extraordinary ways. And one is Sri Lanka, excuse me, where we saw the civil war against the Tamils, the government trying to suppress a Tamil separatist movement. And the other is the Philippines, when Rodrigo Duterte was the governor of the southern province of Mindanao. He was the mayor of Davao. Of Davao, that's right. And in both cases, what we saw were early examples of some pretty egregious human rights abuses, extrajudicial killings, torture, and all sorts of horrific accounts of things that were going on. And in both those cases, the perpetrators really were allowed to get away with it. Why does impunity matter?
Yeah, I mean, it matters because, I mean, just look at what has happened in Sri Lanka over this past year. Also with, the extent to which people have taken to the streets to oust the Rajapaksa's government, which came back to power. So I think, on Sri Lanka, I wanted to tell that sort of longer arc of the story because, it was one of the first issues that I worked on in my time at Human Rights Watch. It was extremely difficult in those final months of the war when it seemed like the Tamils were just being shelled relentlessly by the government, and despite all our best efforts to try and get discussions and to try and get resolutions at the UN Security Council, at the Human Rights Council, we were not successful.
Because just to be clear, what was happening was that towards the end of the war, the government had moved a lot of civilians into an area that they described as no-fire zones, right?
They claimed it was a no-fire zone, but free-fire zone would have been more accurate. It was effectively herding all the civilians and the Tamil fighters into the same area, and then claiming that anyone who was in that area was, a Tamil tiger and a militant, and therefore they were entitled to kill them. It was really difficult to work on this issue, and we were not successful initially at the Human Rights Council. But that impunity, and the fact is that in the years after the war, in the months after the war, this trophy footage started to leak out, really horrific images of people being executed at close range, women whose bodies had been mutilated and raped. More and more of these stories started to surface, and the UN Secretary General did set up a panel to investigate accountability, which found that war crimes had likely been committed. And that set off this chain of a new process of accountability through the UN Human Rights Council. And years later, in 2017, I was visiting Sri Lanka, and I was travelling through the north, the predominantly Tamil areas, and I met mothers who were protesting by the roadside, years later after the war, 8 years later, and they're still looking for their lost children, and they wanted answers. And, I sat with those mothers, and they said to me, the only progress that we've seen here in Sri Lanka has come about because of those resolutions in Geneva. If that didn't happen, this government would not even be, answering to us.
But the Rajapaksas came back.
Yeah, they were voted out, and then, then there was this horrendous terrorist attack on Easter Sunday, which you may remember, and, fear brought the Rajapaksa government back. Unfortunately, you had this very sort of corrupt, unaccountable government, which drove that country into economic ruin. And I think that is the pattern of unaccountability, when the perpetrators of atrocities are able to get away with those atrocities and in fact can, cling on to power and remain in power, you're enabling them to continue. And so, it basically became this process of having this very corrupt government. And, ultimately, earlier this year, we did see the ousting of the Rajapaksa government. I don't think it's over for Sri Lanka. The country is still in, extreme humanitarian crisis because of the economic and debt crisis that the government is in. And Gotabaya Rajapaksa is no longer the president, but he has returned to the country. Apparently he's holed up in a military camp somewhere. So I think the question is, what is the international community going to do to ensure that there is some accountability for these crimes?
And we've seen that time and again, where if you don't have accountability, if you don't have documenting of these kinds of crimes, then these situations bubble up again and again, and you end up with more civil rights abuses or human rights abuses, and you end up with more civil conflict, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the failure, I guess, to address human rights violations enables then this cycle of impunity to continue. And I think that's why, so much of our work is also about looking for points of leverage with foreign governments and trying to sort of take steps to raise the costs of committing these human rights violations.
Well, we saw that in the Philippines. We saw Rodrigo Duterte, and you were there documenting Duterte's early murderous administration. When was that? That was back in
2009.
2009.
Yeah. So I testified before a hearing brought by the Philippine Commission on Human Rights about the existence of these death squads that were basically killing petty criminals, drug users, drug suspects in the city of Davao, where Rodrigo Duterte was the mayor. And it was pretty brave that the Commission on Human Rights actually called this hearing in this town where this was taking place.
And with death squads and death squads run by the police that were operating, getting rid of anybody who was challenging or threatening Duterte's administration.
Hundreds of killings. But, this was an issue that wasn't getting much traction in the Philippines, which is one of the reasons why Human Rights Watch worked on it, because the constituency there, wasn't one that, people were really fighting for in the political system. These were petty criminals, they were drug users, they were very poor people living in the slums. And so we worked very closely with this sort of ragtag bunch of Filipino clergy, Catholic priests, lawyers who were doing their best to document these cases, and journalists.
And yet Duterte came back as president and introduced another murderous policy, this time against the people that he saw were drug dealers and drug users.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, after we put out our report, it felt like the number of killings came down temporarily for a while because there was a lot of pressure and there was a lot of visibility. But then after a while, I mean, that was actually, so difficult to see Rodrigo Duterte basically take nationwide this campaign that he'd perfected as mayor, and suddenly you had thousands, not hundreds, of killings taking place. And I mean, the killings continue in the Philippines. And so, really there, the question was, okay, how can the international community intervene? Because, these mass killings are a crime against humanity. And ultimately, the International Criminal Court did intervene. And, they have opened a case. And, Duterte tried to stop that by saying, well, we're going to withdraw from the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute is the statute of sort of international crimes, mass atrocities. But what he didn't realise is that, you can't just suddenly withdraw and that's it. Like it takes, a full, I think it's a year or 2 years to withdraw. And so that meant the court actually did have jurisdiction to look at, a certain period of these crimes. And so there is an open case now.
Let's move on a little bit, because in one of the chapters, your book focuses on, by your own admission, something that at first glance doesn't seem to be that egregious, on clothing restrictions in Indonesia, and particularly in the conservative north. And you write that we also invested time and energy in addressing not only atrocities, but more hidden violations that affected a substantial portion of the population and which, left unchecked, opened the door to more abuses. Why does it matter?
Well, I think it matters in a country like Indonesia because, Indonesia is often, crowned as sort of, this Muslim majority democracy, a shining example of democracy in Southeast Asia. And yet we see this sort of creeping Shariaization, I guess, across the archipelago, which is, if left unchecked, opens the door to further types of abuses and restrictions on women. And women activists in Indonesia talk to us a lot about these issues, but they were very uncomfortable, particularly in very conservative places like Aceh, like West Sumatra, to raise these issues publicly because they were worried about the blowback from Islamists. So for a while, we were unsure whether to tackle this issue. We thought, we're an international organisation, we'll be seen as a Western organisation interfering in, something that's considered, a matter of religion. But ultimately, we decided, look, the situation's getting worse, it's not getting better, and we need to do this work because Indonesian, women are really demanding that, there is some accountability for these abuses. And yes, left unchecked, it leads to all sorts of further restrictions on women. We saw curfews in certain areas. We saw restrictions on women being able to straddle motorcycles, to ride motorcycles in Aceh. We saw further, quite horrendous, barbaric punishments for crimes like adultery in Aceh.
And it seems to me that we're actually seeing this also, the consequences of these kinds of restrictions playing out in Iran at the moment, where we're seeing widespread riots. I think we've had 5 or 6 days continuously of rioting over the death of a young 22-year-old woman, Mahsa Amini, who died after being arrested by the morality police for wearing a hijab that showed some hair. I think at least 5 people have been killed in the riot so far.
Yeah, I think what's happening in Iran, it does show that, this is what happens when, the so-called morality police are left unchecked. And we had also documented, other cases of, abuses by the Sharia police in Aceh also. There was a horrendous case of a woman who was raped in a police lockup, also picked up for committing the crime of seclusion, which is, being with a man who is not, that you're not related to, that you're not married to in a secluded place. But, what's considered a secluded place can be, 2 people studying at home and then suddenly have the door, broken down by nosy neighbours who are saying you're committing, a violation of Sharia law. So I think that's the problem with, a lot of these laws is that, they really embolden, local communities to take action against those who are seen as violating these laws. And I think when we did the work on Indonesia, and even when we do work also on hijab laws in Iran, it's also important to point out that the countries that ban the wearing of burqas or hijabs, that's also a violation. Women should be allowed to wear whatever they want, and it's not the role for the state to be interfering and telling women what they should be wearing.
And France is the most visible example of that at the moment.
Yeah.
Look, you're the director of Human Rights Watch Australia, and you've had plenty of work to do here in this country, and you touched on it earlier when you were talking about the offshore detention centres. Because as Australians, we like to think of ourselves as pretty good about human rights. Our government spends a lot of time lecturing other countries about their abuses, and yet we've also been arbitrarily locking up people who haven't committed any crime, no criminal offence, there's been no due process.
Yeah, I went to Manus Island twice, once in 2015, once in 2017. And writing the Manus chapter was the most difficult one because, still there is, about 100 or so men no longer on Manus Island. They've been relocated to other parts of Papua New Guinea, but they've effectively been dumped there by this government. And, I visited refugee camps on the Thai-Myanmar border, in Lebanon, people who've escaped the war in Syria. But I think the problem that I saw in Papua New Guinea is that, there was just no connection. There was no logical reason for these people to be in PNG on this remote tropical island. This was really a manufactured problem that Australia created because Australia didn't want to, live up to its international obligations. People have the right to claim asylum.
But as you said, Australian government was quite open about the policy. Did Australians really understand what was going on in those camps?
Well, no. I think that's why they put them on Manus Island and Nauru. It was very difficult to get to these places. And, even on my first trip, I tried very hard to push for access to the centre. They didn't allow journalists to visit the island. Ultimately we were successful in visiting the non-detention centre because that was slightly better. But the whole idea was to put them out of sight, out of mind of the Australian people. But, it was just so incredibly damaging to, young men who were separated from their children, from their wives, from their loved ones, in some cases for many, many years. And even for the ones who have been brought here to Australia, they're still in this limbo because they're on these sort of temporary visas, and they still can't reunite with loved ones back home.
We talk a lot about, you talk a lot about extrajudicial killings, you talk about deaths, people being murdered. It's not quite the same category, but we've also got a very depressing, very troubling record, an ongoing record of Aboriginal deaths in custody. Again, you spent some time and you write about it very compellingly, documenting the deaths in custody. Are you seeing progress in that front?
Sadly, no. I think the issue with deaths in custody, we had a Royal Commission looking at these issues, more than 30 years ago now. So, that Royal Commission had a whole host of recommendations. The recommendations are known. What is missing is the political will to address those issues. I visited Broome as part of that research. I met with family members, Aboriginal family members who had lost loved ones in Broome prison. And when I went to the prison, Broome is such a bizarre place because it's, Cable Beach is beautiful, there's this red dirt, there's this crystal clear blue water, stunning beach, and then the prison is right in the centre of the town, right in the middle. And it's archaic. It really felt like stepping back into some ancient system of apartheid where all the prisoners were black, all the guards that I could see were white. The horrendous case of Mr. Jacamara that I included, in the book, all the warning signs were there. He was asking for his mental health medication. He was banging his head against the wall. It shouldn't have been a surprise then that he would take steps to hurt himself. And, tragically he did, and he ended his life.
But so much of it seems to be dealing with symptoms. We talk about policy changes, for Aboriginals in custody, and that means removing any points that you could possibly hang yourself. They were talking about leaving the lights on for video surveillance of prisoners so that for their own protection, so that they would be monitored, so that if they started harming themselves, then the officers would know. But if you're inside that feels like sleep deprivation. It feels like a form of torture. There's still, deep institutionalised racism that doesn't get addressed in any of this.
There is. It's not just about changing the physical infrastructure of prisons so that people don't have access to the tools to harm themselves. You actually need to address, firstly, whether people who with, mental health conditions and cognitive impairments, are there alternatives to incarceration? Should people be in a prison environment, or should they be in, a different type of facility where they can get help? And for people who do need to be imprisoned because they have committed certain crimes, I think the issue is really there, the lack of mental health support and the lack of culturally appropriate mental health care. And, for, nearly half the prison population, something like 40% has a mental health condition, and prison is not a place where your mental health condition gets better. It gets exacerbated by the conditions in detention, especially if you're put in a solitary confinement unit. So it's also about, what are the ways that officers can learn to sort of de-escalate certain types of behaviour rather than just chucking someone, down the back into a solitary confinement unit.
Elaine, there are a lot of extraordinary stories in the book, very moving personal stories, and there's one that I think that really stands out. And I'm mentioning it here because it actually occurred in Australia when an Ethiopian man, or Ethiopian Somali, Shukri Shafi, who was a former judge and Uber driver, showed up at your offices. Just tell us about his story and about how that unfolded, because I think it's a remarkable example of the power of Human Rights Watch.
Yeah, well, that one all started with an email, actually, to our sort of Human Rights Watch general account. And it was a short email from an Ethiopian-Australian organisation. and it said that hundreds of relatives of Australian Ethiopians had been rounded up back home because their relatives in Melbourne had participated in a protest. And I was quite shocked to read this email. And the area that it mentioned, the Ogaden, I knew that Human Rights Watch had reported on crimes against humanity in that area. So I really wanted to know more. So Shukri Shafe, the former judge, came to our office and he told me this very long story about the protests, but also about his own history of being detained and tortured in custody in Ethiopia, and how he'd managed to finally make it to Australia. And as part of that discussion, he pulled out this, very battered Human Rights Watch report, the report that we'd done on crimes against humanity years before. And he said, I've been carrying this report since the refugee camp in Kenya. And, that was when I really knew that, sometimes we do these reports and we're really frustrated that we don't have the change that we want to see in terms of, those abusive governments. But those reports really matter to the people whose stories are being told, because it is telling the truth of what happened to them, particularly at a time when, it felt like no one was really paying attention to what was happening, in Ethiopia, particularly in this part of Ethiopia on the border with Somalia.
And the story of the Ethiopian government's interference too is another particularly troubling one. In fact, there are two examples that you give of foreign governments actually trying to influence behaviour in Australia, to extend their power into Australia. I don't think we've got time to look at the Ethiopian example, but you've got a very personal example of that. And this goes back to your work with UNSW. You were interviewed by the Campus magazine about human rights in Hong Kong. They published your comments. Pick up the story from there. What happened?
Yeah, they published the story on a Friday afternoon, which I thought, oh, God, that's such a waste. It's a terrible time for media. Who's going to be listening to these stories? I got up the next morning on Saturday morning, and when I opened Twitter, my phone kind of exploded, because there had been quite a vociferous campaign by pro-Chinese government students and pro-Chinese government trolls on social media who had taken offence to my comments about Hong Kong's national security law. And so they were demanding for me to be fired from UNSW, they were demanding for me to apologise, they were demanding the Vice-Chancellor resign over these comments. And the whole thing really escalated also because the pro-Chinese government mouthpiece in English, the Global Times, wrote up a story about how the students successfully campaigned to have the article removed. And that's because at some point, UNSW was so scared by all of these, emails and social media posts that they removed the story from their website, which, obviously was capitulating to the demands of the students. They then thought better of it and put it back online, but in a less prominent place. And I think it just really shows how, unfortunately, universities, because of the lack of funding, have really become beholden to, think about, I guess, the desires of those governments where a lot of the students are coming from. And so, adopt this very cautious approach. And that really endangers and imperils freedom of speech and academic freedom.
Elaine, we've been talking a lot about your history, this long history of work on human rights. You've been to some extraordinary places, you've seen some confronting things, you've spoken to a lot of victims, you've seen perpetrators get away with it. Early on in the book, you wrote about the World Social Forum that you went to in 2004. And you took part in all sorts of workshops, all sorts of talks and performances, and you said that, and you write, I was in my late 20s and still not jaded yet. 2 decades on in your late 40s, are you jaded now?
I'm maybe a little bit less idealistic, I think, than I was back then. But, look, I think to do this work, you have to be positive and you have to believe in people and in the power of change and hope. And we've talked about a lot of the horrible sort of atrocities, but I also think the book is really about stories of courage and, just some of the incredible people that I've met throughout my career who, despite all of the, difficult situations that they've found themselves in, have still managed to persevere and to thrive. And so, even in Manus Island, I met this young Rohingya man, Imran, who taught himself English in the camp. He didn't speak a word of English before he got to Manus Island. He's one of the lucky ones who managed to go to the United States, and he got a fellowship to do some work with the Pulitzer Center, to do some reporting, and he's now just won an award for his reporting. And I think that just shows, what people can do if they're given the conditions to thrive, instead of, being placed and dumped and detained on an island somewhere.
In the last 10 minutes or so that we've got left here, I'm going to turn to some questions that we had offered from or submitted by the audience earlier on. One of them is about the Uyghurs in China and Xinjiang. The question is, what's happening to Uyghurs in Xinjiang is devastating, and it's also affecting Uyghurs mentally, even in Australia. What can the Australian government do to help, and what can Human Rights Watch do to help?
It's a very good question, and I think I know where it comes from. Saddam is sitting up there, is an old friend who we've worked with very closely in order to support the human rights of Uyghurs. Look, I think right now, we've seen this incredible UN report. I don't know if you've seen the reporting on it that came out, and it says that the Chinese government, may be committing crimes against humanity. Now they say maybe, we say they are. But for the UN, that's very strong language. And so I think now it's up to the Australian government and other governments to act on that. So what can they do? Well, the Human Rights Council is sitting right now in Geneva. We need a resolution that holds the Chinese government to account. And just because the Chinese government is very powerful and obviously will do its best to try and block those votes, doesn't mean that governments shouldn't try. We need targeted sanctions on Chinese government officials who are perpetrating these abuses, and the companies that are perpetrating these abuses. We also need a law to stop the import of goods that are being made with forced labour from places in China, including Xinjiang. So I think there's a whole lot of things that the government can do, but the time for sort of words of condemnation is past. Like, what we really need to see from the government is action.
Another question is about West Papua. Why does Australia continue to turn a blind eye to the human rights atrocities and genocide of our allies, West Papuans, by the Indonesian military right here on Australia's doorstep, using the Lombok Treaty as an excuse to do so? You might want to explain the Lombok Treaty too.
Yeah, so the Lombok Treaty is an agreement between Australia and Indonesia, which says that neither country will interfere in the sovereignty of either country, and basically becomes an excuse for Australia not to strongly raise the human rights concerns that are happening in West Papua. I don't write about it in this book, but I have been to West Papua myself. I've seen, the intense level of military and security forces and surveillance of ordinary Papuans that goes on in West Papua. And, I think for the last 50 years, it's been, pretty much impossible. It's been very difficult for foreign journalists to travel there to report on what's going on. So those abuses do remain hidden, despite the fact that they are happening on Australia's doorstep. I mean, there's been, there's a case that's coming up now of, a massacre that occurred in Panay. I think it's coming up either this week or next week. It's one of the very few cases where there's actually been a court case. But many of the cases of torture, of arbitrary arrest, of people being displaced from their villages, people are not aware about it because of the lack of access to Papua. So I think that's something very practical. Again, that the Australian government should be asking of Indonesia. I mean, President Jokowi, when he first was elected to power in Indonesia, had actually, made some encouraging statements about Papua, and yet he hasn't been pushed on that by the international community. So even though he said that he would invite the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights to visit Papua, she hasn't, the High Commissioner hasn't been able to go, and there's always been one excuse after another. So, I think really the first step to addressing those issues, it is about shining a spotlight, exposing exactly what is going on.
We've got another question that is more general, but it is an interesting one. Has governance been outsourced to the business sector with a loss of accountability to citizens? And I think this really refers to the rise in corporate social responsibility amongst businesses, and the tendency for governments to sort of leave it to those businesses to work out, for example, where they're sourcing their products from, whether it's coming from Xinjiang or elsewhere. What do you say to that? Do you think governments are abandoning responsibility?
Well, look, I think corporations, it's not just governments that are responsible for human rights violations, so are companies. Companies have responsibilities. And I think there are now these broad areas, of tech, I guess, is one of them, where we are seeing unaccountable companies actually responsible for, huge areas which have massive impacts on human rights. Things like social media companies, if they don't take steps, we allow then the proliferation of disinformation or the proliferation of hate speech that, can be used in ways to, really attack certain minorities in countries. So I do think that there is actually a greater role for governments to hold companies accountable, and I think it's not good enough, simply to say, well, it's up to companies to sort out their supply chains. I think that's one of the problems with the current Modern Slavery Act that we have. It doesn't really have any teeth. So, it's all well and good for the companies that, say that they're ethical and say that, they want to do the right thing and they want to be transparent. But where are the penalties? And I think that's actually where governments do need to play a greater role in terms of, regulating businesses that are committing human rights violations.
One of the things that I came away with from your book is, in fact, a sense of optimism, of hope. You talk about progress. It's often slow and uneven. Sometimes there's backsliding. But overall, you seem to be fairly positive. And I'm going to ask you just to read that section there that I've marked up from there.
Oh gosh, I haven't read this for a while. Our work can be painstaking and draining, and change can take a long time. I stay motivated by celebrating the small but meaningful wins, the freedom of Hakeem or Rahaf or others who we have advocated on behalf of. And I remind myself that things could be worse if we didn't do what we do. Exposing human rights violations raises the cost of committing those violations. And in that sense, we hold the line. We stop the roof from falling in. We don't always get the result we want. We don't always end the senseless killings, free those who should have never been detained, or find out what happened to relatives who disappear. We don't always get to see the perpetrators investigated, prosecuted, and convicted for their crimes. But when human rights abusers know that someone is watching, recording, and exposing these violations, it raises the stakes, putting the threat of accountability into the calculus of their decisions.
Ladies and gentlemen, Elaine Pearson, thank you very much for an extraordinary conversation.
Thanks, Peter.